You're still living in my house, eating my food, and doing nothing with your life." Mrs. Emanuel shouted, "Your mates are married with children, and even your younger siblings are settled. But you, with all your beauty, are still single and untouched." Amaka looked down, avoiding her mother's piercing gaze. "What's wrong with you? Why hasn't any man approached you for marriage?" Mrs. Emanuel demanded. "At 35, you're still a virgin. It's shameful. You should either leave my house or go find a man to marry." Amaka's eyes welled up with tears as her mother's words cut deep. She knew her mother was worried, but Amaka couldn't help feeling suffocated by the pressure. She had tried dating, but none of her relationships worked out. Amaka felt trapped, unsure of what to do next, as her mother's tirade continued, tears streaming down her face. She wondered if she'd ever find love and escape her mother's constant criticism. Mr. Emanuel, Amaka's father, stood calmly in the doorway, watching as his wife, Mrs. Emanuel, scolded their daughter. He knew the reason behind Amaka's unmarried status, a secret hidden from the rest of the family. As Mrs. Emanuel's tirade continued, Mr. Nwankwo stepped forward, his gentle voice calming the storm. "Enough, my dear. Amaka isn't faultless, but she deserves our love and support." Mrs. Emanuel turned, her expression softening slightly. "But she's 35 and still single. What will people think?" Mrs. Emanuel asked. Mr. Emanuel placed a reassuring hand on Amaka's shoulder. "Amaka's beauty shines within and out. We'll find her the right match, in God's time." Amaka smiled weakly, grateful for her father's unwavering support. As the argument subsided, Mr. Emanuel guided Amaka, her daughter, to the backyard, away from prying ears. "Amaka, my dear, don't mind your mother. She worries, but I know your worth." Amaka's eyes welled up anew. "Father, I'm sorry. I feel like I've disappointed you both." Mr. Emanuel hugged her tightly. "Never, Amaka. Your mother and I love you equally, but I understand you best." Amaka wondered why her father always supports her, but was grateful he did. Together, they sat in silence, watching the sunset. Mr. Emanuel's protection and love enveloped Amaka, shielding her from the world's judgments. Amaka sat in her dimly lit room, surrounded by memories of her youth. She stared blankly at the wall, her mind racing with questions. Why me, God? Why am I still unmarried at 35? She thought of her mates, all settled with families. Her younger sisters, Jean and Sophia, had found love and started their own families. But I, Amaka, remain alone. Am I not beautiful enough? Yes, men love me, and they do approach me, but never want to have any carnal knowledge of me." Amaka said silently. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she recalled countless failed relationships. Men would approach her, drawn to her beauty, but once intimacy was mentioned, they'd vanish. Am I cursed? Amaka wondered. She thought of her parents, especially her father, who had always defended her. Why did father always defend me? Does he understand my pain? As the weight of her loneliness crushed her, Amaka broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. God, deliver me from this. I don't want to die a virgin. I want to bear children, just like my mother. Amaka's cries echoed through the house, but she didn't care. In that moment, she surrendered to her emotions, pleading for divine intervention. As she wept, Amaka felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, her life was about to take a dramatic turn. The next day, Amaka wondered why her father always defends her and decided to ask him some questions. Amaka approached her father in the sitting room, determination etched on her face. "Daddy, I need to know why you always defend me," Amaka said, her voice firm. "Even when people insult me for being unmarried at 35, you stand up for me." "Do you know something I don't?" Mr. Emanuel's expression softened, but his eyes hid a secret. "Amaka, my dear, God has his own timing. He hasn't decided it's your time to marry," he said gently. "But is it because I'm cursed or possessed?" Amaka pressed. Mr. Emanuel's face remained calm. "No, Amaka. It's just God's plan. Trust him. Amaka's eyes searched her father's, seeking truth, but Mr. Emmanuel concealed the real reason. Deep down, he knew why Amaka remained unmarried. He was the reason. His jealousy had chased suitors away. He wanted his own daughter all for himself, but he couldn't reveal this to her. Instead, he offered comforting words. Amaka, relax. Your time will come. Focus on your faith and personal growth. Amaka nodded, slightly reassured, but Mr. Emmanuel's inner turmoil lingered. He knew the truth, and never wanted anyone else to know about it. Mr. Emmanuel stepped into his room, a sly smile spreading across his face. Amaka, my beautiful daughter, wants to marry another man, he chuckled to himself. Over my dead body, he exclaimed, his eyes gleaming with amusement. I'm the one who loves her truly. No one else deserves her, he laughed, pacing around the room. I've married her in spirit. No man will ever find her attractive enough to wed. They will see her looking beautiful and nothing else will be involved. Mr. Emmanuel's expression turned sinister. Yes, they'll see her beauty, but I placed a spiritual veil around her waist. No suitor will succeed. I'm the only one who knows the truth, and owns her forever. He cackled, reveling in his secret. Amaka will remain unmarried until I'm gone. Ah, the power I hold. As he laughed, the room seemed to darken, as if shadows danced around him. His obsession with Amaka had grown thicker, a suffocating shroud. Outside, Amaka wondered if her father's words held truth, but little did she know, her father's love had become a toxic cage. Mrs. Emmanuel's friend, Mrs. Felix, visited unexpectedly, and Mrs. Emmanuel called out to Amaka, Amaka, dear, serve us some refreshments. Amaka obediently headed to the kitchen, but as she returned with the tray, her hands seemed to move on their own. The drinks mysteriously spilled all over the floor. Mrs. Emmanuel's face turned beet red. Amaka, what is wrong with you? Mrs. Emmanuel shouted, oblivious to their guest, you're so careless. Your mates are married with children, and you're here spoiling things for me. Amaka tried to apologize, but Mrs. Emmanuel wouldn't listen. Mummy, please, calm down. We have a visitor, Amaka pleaded, but Mrs. Emmanuel continued berating her daughter. Mrs. Felix watched in shock, unsure how to intervene. Amaka, why are you so useless? Can't you do anything right? Mrs. Okonkwo spat. Amaka's eyes welled up with tears. Mrs. Felix cleared her throat, attempting to break the tension. Ah, Mrs. Emmanuel, maybe we should, but Mrs. Emmanuel talked over her. You see, Mrs. Felix, this is why Amaka remains unmarried. She's useless. Amaka's face burned with shame. Mrs. Felix's expression turned sympathetic. Amaka, dear, don't mind your mother. We all make mistakes. As the atmosphere remained tense, Amaka wondered if her life would ever change. Amaka retreated to her room, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Felix turned to Mrs. Emmanuel, concern etched on her face. Mrs. Emmanuel, I understand your frustration, but speaking to Amaka like that wasn't right. Mrs. Emmanuel sighed. I know, but it's just, her mates are married, even her siblings. And Amaka's still single at 35. Mrs. Felix placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Emmanuel's arm. Have you considered that something might be hindering Amaka's marriage? Mrs. Emmanuel shook her head. My husband says we're waiting for God's time. But I'm not happy with this situation. Mrs. Felix's expression turned thoughtful. Perhaps you should investigate the reason behind Amaka's delayed marriage. Mrs. Emmanuel's eyes widened. I haven't done anything. My husband just says God will decide. Mrs. Felix leaned in. Sometimes, divine intervention requires human effort. Seek counsel, visit spiritual leaders, and ask them some questions. Your daughter is still unmarried at her age. Mrs. Emmanuel nodded, determination sparking in her eyes. You're right. I'll do something. This can't continue. Meanwhile, Amaka sobbed in her room, feeling lost and alone. Little did she know, her mother's conversation with Mrs. Felix would set off a chain of events. Mrs. Emmanuel pondered Mrs. Okeke's words. her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. Determined to know her daughter's marital status, Mrs. Emanuel visited Mrs. Felix the next day. Mrs. Felix, I've thought about our conversation. I want to explore spiritual solutions. Mrs. Felix nodded empathetically. I know someone who can help. A powerful spiritualist, she is called Mother. Mrs. Emanuel's eyes widened. Take me to her. I need answers. Mrs. Felix smiled reassuringly. Tomorrow, we'll visit Mother. Prepare yourself for the truth. The next day, Mrs. Emanuel and Mrs. Felix arrived at Mother's serene shrine. Mother greeted them warmly. Welcome, daughters. What brings you? Mrs. Emanuel explained Amaka's situation. Mother listened intently, her eyes sparkling with insight. I sense a strong spiritual bond hindering Amaka's marriage. Mrs. Okonkwo's heart skipped a beat. What kind of bond? Mother's expression turned solemn. A paternal curse. Amaka's father has knowingly tied her destiny. Mrs. Emanuel gasped. Knowingly? But my husband loves Amaka dearly. Mother's words hung in the air like a challenge. Love can sometimes be misguided, leading to unintended consequences. Mother's expression turned stern. Go home and ask Mr. Emanuel why Amaka remains unmarried. He holds the key. Mrs. Emanuel's eyes widened. But how can he know? Mother's voice rose. He knows. And if he refuses to tell, give him this. Mother handed Mrs. Emanuel a small, intricately carved bottle. If he refuses, break this bottle. His life will be forfeit. Mrs. Emanuel trembled. But Mother, is this necessary? Mother Ngozi's gaze pierced. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Amaka's fate hangs in balance. Mrs. Emanuel rushed home, determination burning within. She found Mr. Emanuel, her husband, in his favorite armchair. Papa Amaka, Mother sent me. Tell me why Amaka isn't married. Mr. Emanuel's smile faltered. What nonsense is this? Mrs. Emanuel held up the bottle. Mother says you know. If you refuse, this bottle will seal your fate. Mr. Emanuel's eyes widened. Where did you get that? Mrs. Emanuel's voice firm. Tell me the truth, or face the consequences. Mr. Emanuel's face paled. Fine. I'll tell you. But promise to keep my secret. Amaka scrubbed clothes in the backyard, lost in thought. Suddenly, raised voices carried from the living room. Concerned, Amaka rushed to the front of the house. What's happening? She asked, her heart racing. Her mother held a small bottle, her eyes blazing. Your father knows why you're unmarried, Amaka. Mrs. Emanuel exclaimed. Mr. Emanuel's face contorted in anguish. Please, my dear, don't make me say it, he pleaded. Mrs. Emanuel's voice firm. Tell us, or face the consequences. Amaka's eyes widened as her father crumpled. Forgive me. I did it for love, Mr. Emanuel sobbed. What do you mean? Amaka asked, confusion etched on her face. Mr. Emanuel's tears flowed. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, Amaka. No man deserves you. Amaka's mind reeled. Father, what have you done? Mrs. Emanuel's voice cracked. You've cursed our daughter. Kept her from marriage? Mr. Emanuel nodded, overcome with remorse. I didn't mean to harm her. I just love her too much. The weight of his words crushed Amaka. Father, how could you? Mr. Emanuel's voice trembled. I married Amaka spiritually when she was 10 years old. I decided no man would ever touch her. Amaka's eyes widened in horror. You did what? Mrs. Emanuel stammered. Mr. Emanuel's face contorted. I'd visit her in dreams, with my face covered so that she wouldn't remember. Amaka's world crumbled. You're the reason I've never been married? The reason men dorn away from me? Mr. Emanuel nodded, tears streaming. I loved you too much, Amaka. I couldn't share you. Amaka's scream echoed. How could you, father? You're supposed to protect me, not imprison me. Mrs. Emanuel's face pale. You've ruined our daughter's life. How could you do this? Amaka collapsed, overwhelmed. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. Her father's words shredded her heart. How could you, father. How could you? You did this to me, father. Me, your precious daughter. Amaka said with a cracking voice. Mr. Emmanuel's confession deepened, his tears flowing. Amaka has borne my children in the spiritual realm. She's a mother, but here, she's still a virgin. Amaka's sobs intensified, her heart shattered. Mrs. Emmanuel's face twisted in disgust. You've defiled your own daughter. Undo this curse. Mr. Emmanuel's pleas mixed with tears. I didn't mean to harm her. I just loved her too much. Mrs. Emmanuel's voice firm. Go to mother. Undo the curse. Free Amaka, so that she could feel like a normal woman. Mr. Emmanuel nodded, broken. I'll do it. Forgive me, Amaka. My love was misguided. Amaka's pain-filled eyes met her father's. How could you, father? How could you? We'll get through this. Amaka will marry, have children. You'll undo the curse. As Mr. Emmanuel rose to leave, Amaka's words stopped him. Father, how can I ever? The Emmanuel's family, accompanied by Mrs. Felix, returned to Mother's shrine. Mother, please help us, Mrs. Emmanuel pleaded. Undo the curse. Mother's expression solemn. The only way to free Amaka is if Mr. Emmanuel dies. His death breaks the spiritual bond. Amaka's eyes widened. No, Mother. There must be another way. Mother shook her head. Death is the only release. Mr. Emmanuel's face resolved. I'll do it. For Amaka's happiness, I'll sacrifice myself. Tears streamed down Amaka's face. Father, no. Mrs. Emmanuel's voice cracked. But how can we lose you? Mr. Emmanuel's smile faint. I've wronged my daughter. This is my redemption. Mother handed Mr. Emmanuel a calabash. Break this, and your spirit will be freed. With trembling hands, Mr. Emmanuel shattered the calabash. As night fell, the family returned home. In his room, Mr. Emmanuel lay still, a peaceful smile on his face. The next morning, Amaka discovered her father's lifeless body. Her heart heavy, she wept, Father, rest in peace. Your sacrifice will set me free. Months passed after Mr. Emmanuel's burial. Amaka, finally free from the spiritual bond, began anew. One fateful day, while shopping in the market, Amaka met Alex, a charming young businessman. Their eyes locked, and Amaka felt an instant connection. As they talked, Amaka's heart fluttered. Alex was kind, intelligent, and successful. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a proposal. Overjoyed, Amaka accepted. Their traditional wedding was a vibrant celebration, uniting families and friends. Amaka's beauty shone brighter than ever, radiant in her wedding attire. Mrs. Emmanuel beamed with pride, her heart full of joy. My daughter, finally married to a good man, as Amaka and Alex exchanged vows. Mrs. Emmanuel's eyes welled up with tears. God has blessed me with a wonderful son-in-law. The newlyweds moved to the city, starting a new life together. Amaka flourished in her role as a wife, supported by Alex's love and encouragement. Their love grew stronger each day. Mrs. Emmanuel visited often, reveling in her daughter's happiness. The happiest woman in the village, that's me, she exclaimed. Neighbors and friends congratulated Mrs. Okonkwo on Amaka's fortunate marriage. Your beautiful daughter, once unmarried at 35, now lives with a rich, loving husband. Mrs. Emmanuel smiled. God's blessings are endless. Amaka deserves every happiness. Amaka and Alex's marriage became a beacon of hope in the village. Their love story inspired others, proving that true love knows no age bounds. Not quite long, Amaka gave birth to twin boys, and so, Amaka and Alex lived happily ever after.